Hello everybody and welcome to the latest Manufacturing Management Live panel. My name is Chris Beck, I'm the editor of Manufacturing Management. Today's discussion is being kindly sponsored by Sage, and we're going to be looking at how manufacturers can take advantage of direct-to-consumer or D2C sales channels. Now obviously the pandemic has forced many manufacturers, many companies to look at new ways of getting their products to market, with traditional routes, shops, restaurants and the like, closed by continuous lockdowns. Now, smart companies have taken advantage of digital channels such as Amazon or via their own websites to cut out the middleman and sell directly, which has a potentially massive financial benefit. Barclays research from the back end of last year found that manufacturers could see a £24 billion sales boost over the next 3 years by exploring direct-to-consumer models. 57% of consumers now frequently shop directly from manufacturers. Very encouragingly, a third of those say they do so to help support the UK manufacturing industry. And I'm delighted to welcome Lee Collinson, Head of Manufacturing at Barclays, to the panel today to explore the survey and discuss some of the implications this could have on the sector going forward. Now, one company that's already taken advantage of B2C channels is Swansea-based skincare manufacturer Montagne Jeunesse. Now, they've seen sales soar in the last year or so since the pandemic started, after switching to selling their products via Amazon, with retailers shut. They're planning to embrace more D2C models going forward. Montagne Jeunesse's finance director, Naren Ganesh, is on hand today to tell us about their journey and some of the challenges that they may have faced along the way. Supply chain is a big topic at the moment, not least with Brexit and all the disruption caused by the pandemic. And for any manufacturer looking to establish new sales channels, getting their supply chain right at both ends is vital. Now is the time to make sure that your supply chains are robust and ready to take advantage of new opportunities. And to help provide advice on that, I'm very pleased to welcome Alex Hislop, Vice President of Retail and Consumer for the UK and Ireland at DHL. And our final panelist is Rob Sinfield, VP of Product, again, our event sponsor, Sage. Rob's going to be explaining how Sage's products and technology in general, can help manufacturers embrace the opportunities provided by the disruption to supply chains and distribution models, as those models become increasingly lean and streamlined and begin to change. So Rob, I'm going to come to you first to open our discussion up today. How have distribution models for manufacturers changed in the past year or so?
Well, thank you for having me on to talk about this, Chris. I think first of all, the pandemic has significantly accelerated technology adoption and digital transformation. In some instances, there's this talk of a quantum leap of a 7-year acceleration of digital transformation in manufacturers and distributors. Now, if you think about it, what's caused that? Well, it's the increase in remote working and collaboration. That certainly changed it. It's the increase in customer demand for online services and the ability to purchase things online, which has certainly changed the way that we're doing things. And it's also that people are looking at new ways of adopting technology to be able to do this. So as a result of this, I think what you're seeing with supply chains is they have to become more robust. It's not as easy for companies to procure items from other countries, bringing them in. Added on top of that was the complexity of Brexit, and we've seen the impact of Brexit, and what it's doing to supply chains is forcing people to be even more aware of that. So I think what you're going to see going forward is technology enabling people to look at new opportunities for near sourcing or reshoring, so bringing things back to the UK. And ultimately, that's going to revitalize the UK manufacturing industry and really help us to achieve new heights. So that's kind of what I would say is the starting point.
Sure. Lee, I'll bring you in now. I mentioned the research that Barclays undertook last year into direct-to-consumer sales. Now, of course, the pandemic has changed the way that we all shop and the way that manufacturers such as Naren's, who we'll speak to in a minute, get their products out to market. But was the trend heading that way anyway? A bit like Rob was saying, has the pandemic accelerated a trend, or is this relatively new for quite a few manufacturers?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me on today. If you go back 18 months to the sort of autumn of 2019, we actually commissioned our first piece of work on consumers going direct, called a Going Direct report. It emphasised a sort of £13 billion benefit over the next 5 years. What we've really seen, though, is the pandemic accelerate that. So we're now seeing £24 billion benefit over the next 3 years. So we commissioned this extra research at the end of last year, and it really shows that consumers are adopting direct-to-consumer sales from manufacturers, and manufacturers are increasingly accelerating this channel. It's in some cases bringing that channel to life for the first time.
Absolutely, yeah. Naryn, your experience echoes what Lee and I suppose Rob have just said there. What's happened with you guys in the last year since
I'll pick up on Lee's comments, because again, in the autumn of 2019, we took the decision to hire our first dedicated e-commerce person, because we had dabbled with Amazon for many years, had never had much success with it because we didn't really understand it. So to put numbers into perspective, in the 2019, the sum total of our Amazon sales were about £78,000. If you fast forward to the end of December last year, we'd gone over 1.6 million. And that was a response to the early days of the pandemic, where, having had this plan to have a concerted approach to e-commerce, and particularly the Amazon platform, by hiring a dedicated resource for the first time, as some of our a lot of our existing retailers started closing stores or started saying, we can't take your stock because you're not priority items. So the biggest distribution channels for us is in the grocery sector, so supermarkets. And our supermarket customers were, as you recall back at that time, were under pressure to supply toilet roll and pasta and the essentials, and therefore cosmetic face masks were deemed far less essential. So this basically stopped taking orders, cancelled orders, stopped taking deliveries, and the fashion retailers just shut their stores. So we had to make a very quick tactical decision as to what to do. So we basically kind of switched Amazon on almost overnight. And then the world just went mad, because what happened was we tapped into a section of the market that hadn't really known our product, but was at home and was looking for things to do. And therefore we tapped into this whole sort of pampering and mentality that was very much around at the time, and people started buying in their droves. Now, what it did to us was that we didn't really have the systems, and we don't really have the systems to cope with this, because we're using a rather elderly version of Sage 200, and none of our logistics operations, being entirely B2B based, were geared up for a B2C operation. So we very quickly had to hire people to assemble multi-packs and gift packs, and then we had to work out how the Amazon models actually worked, and the difference between the fulfilled by Amazon model and the self-fulfillment model and the vendor central model, terms which I didn't even realize existed a year ago. And I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but I'm certainly a lot more knowledgeable than I was back then. And then we then started, and we just started selling, and quickly found out that demand was clearly there. The peak of demand was probably June. Then it sort of calmed down, and then in the run up to Christmas again was extremely busy. And what that has done is that it's told us that, first of all, this business of ours, which we had previously did not believe you could make money from in an e-commerce environment. You can. But it's about what products you offer and how you offer them, and understanding what the relative costs are. The second thing it did, it really brought home the importance of service. So if you miss your delivery windows, for example, it affects your ratings on Amazon, and that can be fatal. So when we've flirted with danger a few times, as we've struggled to keep up with demand, and therefore we've had to take the decision to turn certain products off at times rather than compound the problem. Amazon didn't help either, because their fulfillment centers were unable to take stock, so we had to revert to doing it ourselves back in our warehouse in Wales. And I should just to clarify, we're not a manufacturer per se, because we don't physically manufacture ourselves. What we do is we have a number of manufacturers who work with our formulations, and we control the process and free seal of the stock, but we're not physically doing it. So you've got the logistical headache of coordinating a manufacturing base across the UK and the Far East, as well as meeting that demand with fairly archaic systems. So our learnings going forward is that we need to find a way of integrating the Amazon platform into Sage so that we can effectively process orders in real time rather than after the fact, which is what we currently do. And also to really maximize the use of the FBA model, because we find that's the model that works best for us. As volumes rise, then vendor central probably becomes the ultimate destination, but that is, you're looking at much bigger volumes there, because if you then sell to Amazon as a wholesale customer, then you've lost control of pricing. And that is a sort of a factor when it comes to our existing retailers. But the other interesting observation about Amazon is that whilst it very handily replaced lost sales in the early part of the pandemic, we haven't really seen any great evidence of any cannibalization going on. So because our existing retail channels have also come back quite strongly, and particularly in Europe, where the demand in Europe has been very strong this year. So I think we find my conclusion is that we have found a new group of customers rather than having simply had customers who've moved from one channel to the other. Now, nobody can prove that definitively, but looking at the level of sales we have from our existing accounts, there's plenty of evidence to say there's growth in all channels and all customers. So we're not seeing one swapping out into the other. We're actually seeing growth across all. So as far as we're concerned, Amazon is here to stay. We've made our first tentative steps into eBay, and we'll now also begin to think about the feasibility of having our own e-commerce site, which is something the business had done many years ago. But I think now that we understand e-commerce much better than we ever did, having our own site becomes certainly more plausible. So I think that we've gone from being a exclusively B2B business to having a significant B2C business, which I think is now permanent.
Thanks, Nareen. We'll come back to some of those points shortly. Alex, I'll bring you in here just for your thoughts. Obviously, Nareen his company's gone through quite a major change in the last year or so. Is that something you're seeing across the board for companies of all sizes?
Yes, absolutely. What this has meant for companies like, well, DHL and many others is accelerating our use of additive manufacturing, flexible robotics. So what we're seeing now is a heavy investment in robotics and 3D printing farms and additive manufacturing in the UK, in the local sites, which is extremely exciting. There's new commercial models that are coming with that, not necessarily about big, heavy investments in industrial robots. It's also flexible cobots that work alongside you, but are able to switch out from one SKU range to another in a relatively fast time period. And within the same unit, you have 3D printers printing the gripper heads, printing conveyor systems, or whatever's needed for the actual production run. So a far better way for customers to react to consumer trends, often offer scale, but also be able to deal very quickly with seasonality or campaigns or whatever it might be. So some really quite interesting trends that we're seeing in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's an open question, this one, really. How much are manufacturers and their manufacturing operations, I suppose, being driven by changing consumer needs? I mean, I'm obviously we're all consumers, and as I mentioned earlier, we're all buying more online. We're all for very obvious reasons, and I think that's going to stay beyond the pandemic. But we're also shopping more ethically. We're looking at where our products have come from. We're thinking about the supply chain and the people who are working within it. We're thinking about their impact on the environment, and how have manufacturers and how have companies had to change the way they operate to kind of meet that.
I think sustainability is a key issue for a lot of consumers. So what we've seen with this direct-to-consumer boom is a lot of the manufacturers working very closely with either in-house logistics or external providers on things like electric vehicles. We've seen an increasing demand for electric vehicles for that last mile delivery, and consumers are wanting that ethical footprint, because otherwise they're probably less inclined to want to buy direct. So that sustainability is a huge issue for the manufacturers to think about going forward.
I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
So just to expand on that as well, sorry about that. Collaboration about deliveries as well. I think we've probably all been in the situation the last 6 months where we've ordered some things online and we've had 4 or 5 knocks on the door from different companies delivering products to us. And from an environmental point of view, obviously that's not where we want this to be going, at least the trends. So there is a need, there's a shortage at the moment of a solution, but there's certainly companies talking about collaboration of deliveries as well. So whether it's an Amazon person delivering 4 or 5 packages also on behalf of some other orders, or whether it's UPS or DPD, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is that from an environmental point of view, we're not just putting more vans and trucks and bikes on the roads, we're also making the consumer experience more environmentally and impactful.
Absolutely.
Those are definitely, I mean, those are all trends that are really important, and you can certainly see that with the advent of all of the customization that you see around consumers and what their requirements are. You can see additional value added services coming out now. So not only do you have Amazon selling consumer products that they would previously not have done with household electronics like the Alexa devices, but they now offer you subscription licensing. They offer you subscription services on top of that. But if we kind of bring it back to I think to manufacturers and distributors, what's really interesting is the momentous impact that all of this has had on their digitalization strategy. So if you go back to 2017, and McKinsey had carried out a number of different surveys of executives, and nearly 48% of them said that, yeah, digital transformation was a cost-saving strategy. Investment in technology was a cost-saving strategy. Now, if you look at what that is, it's about 30% of them saying, well, if we don't modernize, we're not going to keep pace with our competitors. 38% of saying, if we don't modernize, we're not actually going to get ahead of the competitors. And then 19% of them saying, well, we need to refocus our entire business, which was a little bit what Noreen said about what's happened, where it's a fundamental shift from being a brick and mortar type retail business to working with brick and mortar retailers to going completely online. You need to think about your digital presence. You need to think about how do you reach out to people through those sales channels. You need to get into bed with the big e-com providers like Amazon and eBay. You need to be looking at Shopify, Magento, all of those e-commerce type platforms. But it's also an entirely different mindset in direct to consumer, because people want it now. They're not prepared to wait a week. They want it almost instantaneously. I could go to the supermarket and get it there, but I want that same level of experience. Plus, I want it to be a little bit more special and a little bit more personalized, where you can name the packaging and things like that. You've seen this with companies like Nutella, where you could get customized jars of Nutella now. Nike and Adidas, you can customize the types of products that they're building. So it's not just the exclusive to cars now, it's down to the type of sneaker or trainer that you want, that you can have your name put on that, but you don't want it next week, you want it tomorrow. So there's this, we've created, or the pandemic has created this sense of urgency amongst consumers as well. There's this immediate gratification that's needed. People don't want to wait for anything.
I think it's important manufacturers who are looking to go direct to do the homework first. It is not just as easy as saying I'm going to sell direct. You need to really look at what skill sets you've got in your business, what perhaps you need to actually bring in, where new employees, or whether it's an outsourced partner on logistics or technology. Because if you get it wrong on your deliveries, your returns, your warranties, that will have a damaging effect on your brand. So manufacturers need to give that a lot of thought before they just rush into a D2C model.
Absolutely. I mean, Noreen,
I completely agree. In fact, as I said before, we had already embarked on that by hiring somebody with that specific expertise, because if we tried to do it without it, it would have been a complete disaster. So, we were fortunate in a way that we'd had the foresight to get on board with it. It just we never expected to see the kind of growth that we had, because the circumstances changed the rules of the game overnight for us effectively, and has now led to a situation where I think every aspect of our business is now is being challenged, and Rob's mentioned digitalization. We're no different. I mean, we've taken steps to sort of rapidly improve the quality of our systems and to move into automation as much as possible in a number of areas of business. And I wear two hats. One is the finance director, but also I also look after operations. And in finance, we've already automated our AP solution. We've automated our expenses solution. We are upgrading our version of Sage. We're going to be we're looking at more integration with other platforms potentially. Certainly, Amazon integration, new warehouse systems coming on stream, within the next 6 months. But also, we do a lot of relabeling and repacking for customers, because retail customers all over the world that we supply will sometimes will have their own specific requirements that we have to do in-house, and we are taking our first steps into automating what is now largely a manual process by investing in a conveyor system, which we placed the first order for yesterday, which will be the precursor to a hopefully largely automated function. And we're also looking at robotics, and I think Alex mentioned cobots. That's something we've looked at in the past, and we looked at it about 18 months ago, and we weren't ready for the product then, but now we are certainly in the space where this begins to make more sense for us, and we can see a window of opportunity where we can now start to really exploit these technologies and really make them work for us. So I think the direction of travel for us as a business, particularly for a business that's involved in volume FMCG, where the items we're selling to the consumer retail for £1, it doesn't take a genius to work out where the cost needs to come out of. So any cost that we can remove from our manufacturing supply chain, wherever that may be, is the number one objective, and reducing the amount of manual labor we have, which is also a management burden as well, particularly relatively large number of short-term transient workers as well. If we can avoid that through the clever use of technology, then it's a total no-brainer for us. So we've always known that we had to move in direction, but the organization didn't have the wherewithal or the ability to make it a reality until now. So you can argue that the pandemic has probably focused our minds to make sure that this now becomes front and center of our thinking, whereas it might have been in the past, it was something that we probably may have nod to, but didn't take it as seriously as we should have done. Now it's very much the key to our future growth, and this is very much for us as a growth story, because we see more growth all over, and we're in the unique position of being a relatively small business, but we are selling all over the world, and it's our global reach is our great opportunity, but also the challenge. And I think Rob mentioned nearshoring, and that's something that we're looking at, because although most of our product is UK originated, we have a significant proportion coming from the Far East, and of course with lead times historically being a problem, but also with the scarcity of things like containers and the costs going through the roof, has made manufacturing closer to home, either in the UK or the EU now a top priority. Excuse me. So we've now got a project to look at bringing some of that manufacturing into the UK. And we're also talking to a company in Poland as well about bringing some of that product back from the Far East. So again, it shortens our lead times. It makes us more responsive. It makes our production and stock planning easier, so we can ultimately provide better service. And we are a business that's probably been hasn't changed the way it operated for many years, but we're now rapidly trying to become that properly customer-centric business, where service becomes the principal objective, and trying to move beyond the silos and break the silos down and move and work much more cross-functionally.
Yeah.
And I think ironically, having an organization, half of which has been working from home pretty much now continually since last March, has, if anything, made collaboration easier than it would have been in the office, paradoxically. So the remoteness, but the use of the tools has made I think collaboration has been easier, and we've achieved probably more than had we been left to our own devices. I mean, it's a highly debatable point, but I do feel that we have achieved a great deal in the last year, despite what seemed like very difficult circumstances.
Sure.
I mean, a couple of interesting stats from quite recently. For the first time ever in the world, the amount of money spent on advertising and campaigns for major global brands is now greater on digital marketing than it's been on traditional retail marketing, if we can call it that. So there's a kind of a shift of money as well onto campaigns through Facebook, Twitter, etc. And more discussions around brand performance and calculating kind of lifetime value to a customer. And I think from a manufacturing point of view, that's extremely important because of the price point and because of often there's spare parts, there's returns, there's you just don't buy it once. There is a whole cycle of investment on that piece that's being manufactured. So a lot more discussion around that. And with that, I think Nareen and Rob have mentioned subscription businesses. That kind of also gets hooked in. Much easier now for people to subscribe to services, and it's become a little bit more kind of normal to do that, whether it's your personal subscription for your cat and your dog, or whether it's a food delivery, or with some of the manufacturers nowadays around their products, and some of the car companies talking about some of the spare parts, some of the software downloads. It's all becoming a regular purchase from some of these companies, which obviously is a new trend, but one that's, I think, not going to go away even when the pandemic's over and the shops start opening up again.
It's interesting, that data point in terms of manufacturers now having the end client data, in terms of how they can use that, in terms of build brand loyalty, special offers, etc. So there are other benefits to manufacturers other than purely the getting more sales. We've also seen new product development being much faster for a number of our food manufacturers who are able to get a product out to the end consumer to see if it works or not, rather than having to wait for scarce shelf space in the major multiples.
Well, there's some interesting considerations here that go along with that. So it changes your entire manufacturing model as well, because you're moving from large scale orders that are designed for brick and mortar retailers where it's going to go and sit on the shelves, and you're producing in thousands or multiples of thousands, to producing one-offs or multiple small packages, which in itself brings a huge amount of challenges. You mentioned transient labor and bringing that on board. Until the automation is in place, you need people to pack those boxes. So instead of them packing one container load or a crate load or something like that, they're packing one crate with hundreds of individual deliveries on it. So the way that you manage your supply chain, the way that you work with your delivery channel, the way that you work with the vendors that are managing for you becomes incredibly different in terms of the way that you think about things. I'm assuming as well, Nareen, you mentioned that you've seen cyclical changes to your business as well, where there have been these spikes. And that's also something that businesses will have to get used to in a direct-to-consumer environment. Is it won't necessarily be as linear. It's going to be a lot more cyclical, where there are going to be spikes, there are going to be peaks and troughs. And how do you manage that peak and trough in demand? So it puts a huge amount of emphasis on efficient demand replenishment planning. Do you have the right type of procurement processes, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, and that's absolutely right, because hitherto, I would say that our business has relatively stable demand. There was some seasonality, particularly around gifting. We had traditionally two customers who would take gifts, in the run up to Christmas. But other than that, you could say demand was it wasn't terribly cyclical. Amazon last year had two huge spikes. One in the spring, which we think was a direct response to the pandemic, and then the second was in run up to Christmas, which was kind of more obvious. So, but also because our offerings were, shall we say, fairly embryonic and not very sophisticated, we weren't really managing around the relevant the various cyclical events like Mother's Day or Valentine's or those other things. So our gifting offering, which is and gifting has become the big opportunity for us, because that is typically not generally on sale within our normal retail channels, but has become very much not quite exclusive, but almost exclusive to Amazon. That's where the big opportunities are for us as a business. So, and you mentioned planning. Fortunately, we knew that planning was our Achilles heel, and we recently hired somebody who completely understands how demand planning should work, and she's in the space of the last month has already made huge strides to improve the level of visibility of our stock cover and what's like to be driving our production demand. So yeah, we so our business had traditionally worked on the basis of almost producing to order, but maintaining very high inventory levels as a result, to being now having to be much better at planning demand and building stock levels in anticipation of that demand. So it's required something of a mindset shift in the business to think in those terms, and I think it'll bear fruit, because we've now got the skills in the business, and it does come back to having the right people. We do have people now who understand how these things work. We didn't have that before, because we sort of managed to get away without needing those skills in the past. But because things have changed fundamentally for us, it required us to also change some of our people to upskill. And there's a general trend in our business of upskilling to be able to take advantage of these opportunities.
Absolutely. A slightly different question from me. Obviously, we've talked a lot about companies that are able to sell direct to consumers, either via supermarkets or Amazon. But there are countless other manufacturers out there that aren't selling direct to consumers. They're further down the supply chain. They're supplying to other manufacturers. Can you see a knock-on effect coming essentially down the chain of, as the end consumer's demands change and change that manufacturing distribution model? Can you see that coming down the supply chain and affecting other manufacturers?
Now, personally, I think manufacturers across the whole supply chain need to be flexible and agile. 98% of them are still working very much closely with their retail and wholesale partners, but they've got to be able to look at how they can adapt, and particularly this word digitalization. That's going to be the key for the future. Are they still fit for purpose in terms of how they interact as part of the wider supply chain? And are they following the trends in the marketplace? I think are the key things from my perspective.
And to build on that, I'd say also, there's aggregators in the market. There's people coming, or companies coming in like the Hut Group, who are not only helping companies with their digital strategy, but also able to help also with some of the fulfillment parts. And that's a great benefit to many companies, manufacturers of brands and non-branded goods. But I think also through some of the aggregators, just a way of also taking away the hassle of, some companies either don't have the resource or don't have the strategic plan yet to set up their own direct to consumer. But there are aggregators out there who can do that for them. And so they could still hand over some of the stock or some of maybe the tail of their SKU portfolio to those companies. So there's still a direct to consumer channel, but they maybe aren't the guys running the whole show themselves. And that's, I guess, a choice. Do you want to own the data? Do you want to own the consumer interaction or not? And some companies have just a different approach to that.
Well, there's another side effect to this, and as much as we don't like the reality of it, there's going to be a lot of consolidation, both upwards and downwards along the supply chain. You're going to see people acquiring key suppliers so that they do not run the risk of that supplier disappearing. I think COVID and the impact of the pandemic has scared a lot of companies, not just in, well, we've got low cost production out in China, as Nareen mentioned, but also, can we monitor the production in the right way? Especially, Nareen, you mentioned exchanging recipes and what have you. In an environment which is controlled, you need to make sure that the people, the licensees that are producing this for you, are doing that in exactly the right way that you need to.
Yeah.
Not having eyes on the ground in a manufacturing center in China, being able to tour that or something like that is complicated. So you will see a lot more vertical integration. There's going to be a lot of acquisitions, I'm pretty sure. smaller manufacturers will be incorporated into those that are dependent on them. You're also probably going to see a lot more manufacturing as a service starting up, where those manufacturers who are intelligent in how they go about things will be acquiring more of the machinery, will be investing in CNC machines, they'll be investing in the skills that go along with that, and renting out capacity to other manufacturers so that they can support bespoke requirements from customers. Because even though there's this desire to upskill, it takes time. And reskilling of people also takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. You can't go out and find a demand management specialist in the space of a couple of weeks and get them onboarded. If they're not in the market, it's pretty difficult to find those skills already. So that's why I think there is an opportunity for those manufacturers out there that have extra capacity to change their manufacturing models. We have customers that have done this successfully, where they were manufacturing plastic goods and have now transitioned to respirators. Now that there's no need for respirators, they're transitioning to something else. They're changing the molds that they're using, the technologies that they're using, and renting out their capacity because there's not a market for the plastic widgets that they were producing before.
Absolutely, yeah. The event of the last year or so, like we've said a couple of times during this discussion, have really accelerated change and given companies a chance, I think, to reevaluate what they were doing, whether that's what they were physically making or their supply chains. We've spoken a little bit about reshoring and bringing manufacturing a bit close to home. Alex, I liked your point that you made about additive manufacturing, really bringing your supply chain in-house, as it were, and having full control over your supply chains. That's something that you're seeing more and more companies investing in, additive manufacturing and that way.
Yeah, definitely. Without a doubt, they are. I think some of the companies might have been experimenting with additive manufacturing or 3D printing farms like 12 months ago. Many of those companies are now actually implementing them and using them in their production, or using them for tangible purposes. Not only selling, does it save money for them long term, but also it brings control and ownership of stock right into their courtyard or their factory four walls. And we also see the commercial model that's going with that being very attractive to them. Now, either that's companies wanting to do it themselves, a bit like Rob was saying, the intelligent companies who have the engineers and the right skill set within their businesses can redeploy people into that new area, and they just get on with it and sell those services. Then there's other companies who don't have that, and they're looking to bring those in-house because they have the production capacity, they have the space to be able to do this. And the fact that you can actually rent some of this machinery as well, so you're not tied down to the long-term investments, is also commercially attractive. A number of companies that we're working with at the moment are very seasonal. So there might be Easter egg production, or it might be Christmas gift boxes, the actual boxes that gift packs go into. Well, they only want that service for 3 or 4 months. And now with this, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, it allows you to turn on those type of flexible manufacturing services and also turn them off and redeploy those assets elsewhere when they're no longer needed.
Lee, are you seeing manufacturers, even in this difficult economic climate and all the uncertainty that's around, are you seeing manufacturers beginning to invest in new technologies, new ways of doing things, I suppose?
Yes, after the pandemic struck, we actually thought people may sort of fall back from that capital expenditure, but it's the total contrary. We've seen people looking at their supply chain resilience, looking at how they can bring back stuff onshore, and also looking at how their factories operate, partly from a social distancing perspective, but also how they can do things more efficiently, and also meet the carbon targets from 2030 onwards. So we see a lot of investment going into that, ranging from new machinery, LED lighting, electric vehicles. A whole range of proposals have been presented to us, and that is a very big growing area from our perspective.
That's a good sign, I suppose. It shows that Noreen's a case in point. Investment brings reward. You've invested in new people, new ways of doing things, and you're seeing the rewards from that within
Yeah,
a
I mean,
year.
there was I joined the business just over 2 years ago, and it was pretty apparent back then that the business had to change. It fundamentally hadn't changed the way it operated for 20 years, and you could tell. And it had lapsed into I think a lot of complacency again about how things were, and I think you needed so I'd already decided that we had to drag this business into the 21st century. Unfortunately, our owner was also similarly motivated to do the same thing. So we have let's say a benign environment where change is very much expected. There's an appetite for it. Sometimes we like to go more quickly than he does, but we have ultimately ended up where we need to end up in terms of particularly in terms of people and the organization as well, because we shouldn't underestimate that having the right business structure and the right people is, I think, about 8/10 of the problem a lot of the time, because the rest of it is it's relatively straightforward. But if you don't have the people who don't fundamentally understand the jobs they're trying to do and why they're trying to do them, and how they can then adapt to change, you'll go absolutely nowhere. And we were, I think, a case in point. So I can look across our business and see a number of new people who are just, let's say, offer something completely different to what we've had in the past. A different perspective as well, because we have a lot of people who've been in the business for 20 years plus, who didn't really have any other perspective other than Montagne-ness. And a number of new people are now bringing in new ideas, new energy, and a new perspective on things, which is also helping to drive that change. So I think for us, a number of factors have suddenly coalesced to create the critical mass that has now created that explosion of growth opportunities, new investment in technology, new investment in people, different approaches, a channel approach to the market rather than just let's say a rather sort of one-dimensional approach. More rapid new product development cycles, just more focus everywhere, and that's it is now beginning to pay off.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what we're seeing is also a lot of more discussion on the returns process. So as manufacturing businesses are getting into going direct to consumer, there's more trends around obviously sustainability, the circular economy. The discussions now about the returns process and how to either reuse product, reshape it, re-engineer it, or refurbish it are very topical. Typically, if I look back 4 or 5 years within the context of the company I work with, we very much looked at the pushing out of a product and the delivery of the product to the doorstep. Now, industry is really starting to shape and say, well, we need a very efficient recycling or returns process to close the loop, but also do it from an environmental point of view and a commercial point of view that's attractive for these different manufacturing companies.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll just begin to kind of wrap up now. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Rob, obviously we've talked about a lot in the last 40, 50 minutes or so. How can Sage kind of bring all that together? We've spoken a lot about customer data, customer interaction, and what role does Sage play in all this?
So I think I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that Noreen said, and one of them is that I think companies need to move away from this idea that keeping pace with technology and what have you is a burden. Yes, it is a short-term burden, and changing a system or keeping a system current always feels like it's the last thing that you want to do. But it is critically important to be able to set you up for the future with investments around new types of APIs, strengthening the partnerships that we have with vendors like Amazon and other e-commerce providers. That's incredibly important that customers are able to take advantage of that. We're working on a number of different data management strategies that will help growing manufacturers and distributors to maximize the benefits from that. Integrated supply chain. So this idea of looking to the ERP as almost a burden. Oh yes, we have to have one. It's kind of sits with the finance team. It's not. it is an enterprise capability that spans across the entire company, from the shop floor all the way through to the finance functions. Being able to have that seamless overview is incredibly important. So tightly integrated is where there's an opportunity to help. Now, where Sage can help is obviously there's a variety of mechanisms. Obviously through software investments, we're continuing to do that. We're investing in new technologies like APIs. We're investing in open ecosystems and open applications. Comprehensive data management strategies. Integrated supply chains is another thing that we're investing in within Sage. Making sure that companies can remain compliant throughout all of this is another area where, again, partnering with someone like Sage can really help companies, because we have the ability to manage that on scale, not just for one customer, but for hundreds of thousands of customers across the UK and globally. I think the other thing that we need to think about when we talk about technology as an enabler is, yes, we talk about the cloud. Moving to the cloud is incredibly important, but there are different flavors of the cloud, and that's, I think, incredibly important as well. As you look at manufacturers, just as consumers want bespoke solutions, manufacturers want bespoke solutions, because the way that one company does something is quite different to another. You can talk to two metal fabricators on the same street in Yorkshire somewhere, and they will tell you that the way that they fabricate the metals are completely different. Somebody will use a 2-ton press, somebody will use a 3-ton press. They'll apply this much pressure per inch. They may have different order management processes. Is it an engineer to order? Is it a configure to order? Is it a make to order? Is it a repetitive manufacturing process? So bear that in mind. Look at the solutions that are right for you. Choice is another area that Sage can help. So that combination of factors is really what sets us apart, and why Sage has been around for 30 plus years, nearly 40 years, supporting manufacturing and distribution companies across the UK and helping them to grow.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Rob. And thank you to all of our panelists, to Lee, to Alex, to Narina, and to Rob, and to Sage for sponsoring it. Thank you, everyone who's watching. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next Manufacturing Management Live panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.